The shop owner took the money from the cash register and began to count it. He then turned to the worker and said, "You can go home." "Okay, Mr. Jones," the young man said, picking up his raincoat. "Bye, Mr. Jones." "See you tomorrow," the shop owner said. "We should go now," the shop owner said to his wife. His wife picked up the key and went to lock the shops. The man took the money to his office, put it in a safe, came out, locked the room, and joined his wife. "We can go now." On their way home, his wife said, "Tomorrow night we are invited to Dave's birthday party." Then she added, "I should buy a present for him, so I will be at the shop just a few hours." "I don't need you tomorrow. You can do whatever you want," Jones said. "Are you sure you don't need me at the shop?" Mrs. Jones asked. "Yes, I am. By the way, don't buy an expensive gift." "Don't worry," his wife replied. Jones and his wife had a good time at the party, laughing and drinking. They lost track of time and left Dave's home at midnight. The next morning, when they opened the shop's door, they were shocked and couldn't believe what they were seeing. The lock of the shop's door was broken. Jones ran to his office hastily. He shouted, "The money! All the money has been robbed!" His wife halted near the door, gazing at the safe quizzically. "Why are you standing there? What are you gazing at? All the money has been robbed. Don't stay there. Call the police," the man roared. "I'll call now," she said, and went to the telephone. After several minutes, the police arrived and started to investigate. As Jones strolled in the room, he faced his wife and said indignantly, "Why hasn't Tom come yet?" "I don't know," she responded. She then turned to her husband and said, "Why is that police officer scrutinizing the door's handle?" Jones rose and went to the policeman. "Why are you scrutinizing the door?" the shop owner asked. The officer didn't answer. Another police officer came forward and said, "Inspector, nothing has been burglarized except the safe." The inspector turned to Jones and asked, "Are you the owner of the shop?" "Yes, I am," he answered. "What has been stolen?" the inspector asked. "The money, all the money that was in the safe," Jones said, interrupting the police officer who was about to speak. "I want to see the safe," the inspector said. "It's in my office. Come with me. I'll show it to you." The inspector, the police officer, and Jones entered the office. The inspector went near the safe and examined it carefully. Then he asked, "How many employees do you have?" "My wife, me, and Tom." "Where is he?" the inspector questioned. "He hasn't come yet." "Do you have a video camera installed at your shop for surveillance?" the inspector asked. "Yes." "I want to see the recordings," the inspector said. Jones and the inspector started to watch the footage. "It has just recorded a hand of the burglar at the moment they were trying to break it down," the police officer said. The inspector looked at the police officer, then faced Jones and said, "Play it again. I want to see it more closely." After watching the footage several times, the inspector began to search around. The police officer approached him and said, "Inspector, do you think their work committed the robbery?" "Maybe," the inspector replied. "Should I go to his home and inquire?" "No, not yet," the inspector replied. The video recording was watched many times. "Mr. Jones, what is that back door for and where does it open to?" the inspector asked. "The back door opens to a lane. Can you open it for us, Mr. Jones?" "Yes, of course." The inspector and the police officer went to the narrow lane. "Why does only this shop have a door in this small and narrow lane?" the police officer asked. "You should ask this question to the shop architect," the inspector replied. Then he got back into the shop and said, "Mr. Jones, do you always keep your money here in the safe box?" "Yes, when we stay until late." "Could you tell me how much was in the safe box?" the inspector asked. "More than $15,000, Jones said, then added, "I decided to put it in the bank this morning." "Why didn't you take it home with you?" the inspector asked. Jones hesitated for a moment, then replied, "I thought the safe would be secure enough overnight. We've never had any issues before." The inspector nodded thoughtfully. "Understood. Let's continue. They inspected the back door leading to the narrow lane. The inspector noticed there wasn't any marks around the door frame. "Mr. Jones, have you noticed anything unusual around here recently? Suspicious individuals or activities?" the inspector inquired. "No." Joan answered. Mr. Jones wrote down Tom's home address and called a police officer over, handing him the address. "I'm very interested in talking to him," the inspector said. The inspector then opened the back door and stepped into the lane. A stack of newspapers caught his attention. He picked them up, flipped through the pages, and selected one, tucking it under his arm before returning to the shop. "Does Tom know where your safe box is or where you keep the key?" the inspector asked. "Yes, he does," Jones replied. "Very well," the inspector nodded. Not much time had passed when a police officer arrived with Tom, the inspector and Jones waiting for him in Jones's office. The officer entered and said, "Inspector, he's here." "Mr. Jones, would you leave us alone?" the inspector requested, then turning to the police officer, "Bring Tom in. I want to talk to him." The officer complied. Jones left the room and Tom entered. The inspector closed the door. "Could you tell me, Tom, what is your shoe size?" the inspector asked. "My shoe size is 41, Tom replied. "May I see your hands?" the inspector requested. As Tom showed his hands, he said, "I swear I haven't robbed Mr. Jones." The inspector opened the door and said, "Wait for me outside," then called for Jones and his wife. "He confessed, didn't he?" Jones asked. "What is your shoe size, Mr. Jones?" the inspector inquired. Jones, visibly frustrated, responded, "I haven't lost my shoe. You're here to find the thief who stole my money." "We will. Just answer the question," the inspector insisted. "My shoe size is 41, Jones finally replied. "May I see your hands?" the inspector asked, then turned to Jones's wife, repeating the question. The inspector turned to the police officer and instructed, "Call Tom." Tom entered. "How long have you been working here?" the inspector asked. "More than 2 years, sir," the worker replied. "Are you satisfied with your job?" the inspector continued. "Yes, sir," Tom answered. The inspector smiled and then queried, "Do you always come to work late?" "No, sir," the worker responded. "Then why didn't you come on time today?" the inspector asked. "Today is my day off, sir," the worker explained. "A day off, but your boss was waiting for you," the inspector remarked. "Waiting for me?" Tom questioned. "Yes, for you," the inspector affirmed. "But last night he called me and said, 'I don't need you tomorrow,'" Tom stated. "He called you and said that?" the inspector verified. "Yes, sir," Tom replied. Jones shouted, "He lies! I didn't call him." The inspector turned to Jones and asked sternly, "Are you sure about that?" Jones hesitated, then asserted, "Absolutely, I did not call him." The inspector glanced at Tom, then back at Jones, considering the conflicting statements carefully. The inspector said, "Tom, do you know that the shop was burglarized last night?" "Yes, sir. The police officer told me," Tom responded. "Where were you last night?" the inspector asked. "At home, sir," the worker replied. "Do you have an alibi?" the inspector inquired. "No, sir." "Okay, Tom, you can go now. I have no more questions," the inspector said. Tom approached the door. Before leaving, the inspector asked, "Which door do you usually use to enter or exit the shop?" "The customer's door, sir," Tom answered. "Very well, thank you," the inspector acknowledged. The inspector then turned to Mrs. Jones and said, "Now, I want to talk to you, Mrs. Jones. Could you please leave us alone?" "Please take a seat, Mrs. Jones." "Do you know why your husband called his employee last night and asked him not to come to work today?" the inspector questioned. "No, I don't know," she replied. "Where were you last night?" the inspector asked. "My husband and I were at my brother's birthday party," she answered. "Do you have the code to the safe box or the key?" the inspector continued. "No, only my husband knows the code," she said. "He never gave it to you?" the inspector queried. "I never asked," Mrs. Jones responded. What time did you and your husband return home last night? The inspector asked. Midnight or a little later, she replied. When you or your husband want to enter or leave the shop, which door do you use? The inspector asked. We use the front door to enter, but we use the back door to leave the store, she explained. I have no more questions for you. You can go, the inspector said. As she rose to leave, the inspector added, You're wearing comfortable shoes. Do you always wear such shoes? Yes, these are very comfortable. I always wear them here. But why do you ask, Inspector? Mrs. Jones responded. I want to buy a pair for my wife, the inspector said with a smile. She left the room. The shop owner entered the room and the inspector gestured towards a chair. Jones sat down. Why did you call your employee last night and tell him not to come to the store today? The inspector asked. Jones looked surprised. I didn't call him. He's lying. Well, your employee claims that you called him last night and told him you didn't need him today, that he could take a day off, the inspector explained. He's lying. I didn't call him last night. He worked here with me yesterday. If I didn't need him, I would have told him before leaving the shop. Why would I call him? Jones retorted. Who knows the code to the safe besides you? The inspector questioned. Nobody. What are all these questions for? Are you suggesting that I rob my own money? Jones asked incredulously. A policeman knocked on the door, entered the room, handed a letter to the inspector, and then left. We are trying to find the thief or thieves, and if you don't cooperate, it will be difficult to catch the guilty person or people, the inspector said. He then asked, Why didn't you keep the money in a bank account? The inspector gazed into Jones's eyes and asked, Did you go straight home after the birthday party? Yes, I think so, Jones replied. So you're not sure? The inspector pressed. I had too much to drink. I really don't remember, Jones admitted. Did you call a cab? The inspector asked. No, my wife drove the car, Jones answered. Where did you park your car when you arrived home? In the garage or on the street? The inspector asked. Can your wife drive? The inspector asked. Yes. Who usually locks the shop's main door every night? The inspector inquired. Either me or my wife. Who locked the door last night? The inspector pressed. I did. From which door do you and your wife enter the store? The inspector continued. The front door. And when you two leave the shop? The inspector queried. The back door, he replied. The inspector then said, No further questions. Thank you. Jones left the room. Inspector Davies faced the police officer and said, Let's get back to the police station. But my money, you allowed the thief to leave here, Jones said, frustrated. We haven't completed the investigation. Wait for our call, the inspector replied, and they left Jones's shop. Many days passed. Jones and his wife were busy at the shop when the telephone rang. Hello? May I talk to Mr. Jones? A voice asked. Speaking. Mr. Jones, please come to the police station with your wife. Have you found the thief who stole my money? Jones asked. You will know soon enough. The call ended, and Jones turned to his wife. We have to go to the police station immediately. Jones and his wife arrived at the police station and were directed to the inspector's office. You found him? Yes. Tom robbed my money. I knew it, Jones exclaimed. Mr. Jones, please calm down. If you want to know if we found the thief, the answer is yes, the inspector said. Where is he, Inspector? I want to see him. You will, the inspector said, opening his office door. Bring him in. A man entered the room. Jones and his wife rose, unable to believe what they were seeing. Jones's wife exclaimed, No, he is not the thief. You are wrong. You should arrest Tom. It's impossible. He was with us until midnight. How could he have had time to do such a thing? He has no access to my keys and the code, Jones argued. Mr. Jones, is your safe box code number 41241? The inspector asked. Jones was totally confused. How do you know it, Mr. Inspector? Well, you are wearing a brand name and expensive shoes. When I searched for it, I realized there is only one boutique that sells them in the city at 412 Rose Boulevard, and your shoe size is 41. Jones turned to his brother-in-law. Dave, tell me he is wrong. It wasn't you. Dave stayed silent. When you were terribly drunk, he understood your safe box's secret code, the inspector explained. Then he handed Jones a newspaper found near the shop's back door. Look at the crossword puzzle number. Why? Jones said. Inspector put the newspaper on the desk and said, You didn't know your brother-in-law is a gambler.